look at what Vietnam and Kenya are doing to wire up their rural communities and ask whether those top-down government models can actually stick. Plus, we've got a fascinating pair of stories about rural women entrepreneurs in India who are building real businesses without a dollar of venture capital. And we dig into some foundational innovation theory that still has plenty to say about how rural communities share knowledge. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Gan.
And this is the Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
Let's start with the research this week. And I want to begin with a piece that might seem the least obviously rural, but I think it actually has the most to say about where things are heading.
The Aerospace Network's paper.
Right. So this is a survey article published in IEEE Communications, Surveys and Tutorials. The full title is Aerospace Integrated Networks Innovation for Empowering 6G. And what the authors are doing is pulling together the literature on what they call aerospace integrated networks, which is really a catch-all for satellites, high-altitude platform stations, and unmanned aerial vehicles all working together as a single system.
So not just satellites on their own, a whole layered stack.
Exactly. And the argument is that 6G, the next generation of wireless connectivity, can't be delivered by terrestrial networks alone. The coverage gaps are too large, the terrain too varied. So the architecture being proposed is this three-layer model: space segment, which is your low Earth orbit satellites; aerial segment, which includes high-altitude platforms sitting at around 20 kilometers, and drones lower down; and then the terrestrial segment we already know.
Okay, so before we get into the design details, who's actually affected here? Because when I hear 6G and satellites, I think, that's a long way from a grain elevator in rural Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan.
It's exactly the grain elevator, though. That's the point. The survey is explicit that the places conventional 5G won't reach, remote agricultural regions, mountainous communities, island communities, are precisely where this layered architecture is supposed to fill the gap.
All right, so what do the authors actually find? What's the state of play?
A few things stand out. One is that the technical challenges are real and underappreciated. Managing a heterogeneous network, where a signal might hop from a drone to a high-altitude platform to a satellite and back down, introduces massive coordination problems. Latency, interference, handover between layers, these aren't solved.
And that matters for what kinds of applications specifically?
It matters enormously for anything real-time: precision agriculture using autonomous equipment, remote telemedicine, emergency response in disaster zones where terrestrial infrastructure is gone. All of those applications require low-latency, reliable connections, and the current architecture can't guarantee that across all layers simultaneously.
What about the enabling technologies? What needs to exist before this is actually deployable at scale?
The survey covers a lot of ground here. Software-defined networking, essentially making the network programmable and flexible rather than hardware fixed. Edge computing pushed out to the aerial layer. And AI-driven network management, because the complexity of coordinating these layers in real time is beyond what human operators can handle manually.
That last one is interesting. You're essentially saying the rural connectivity solution depends on AI being embedded in the network itself.
Which I think is a kind of hidden dependency that doesn't get talked about enough in rural broadband policy conversations. We talk about satellites as if Starlink is the solved answer, and it's a real improvement, no question. But the 6G vision is substantially more complex and substantially further away.
What are the limitations of this survey? Because it's a survey, not primary research. So what should we be cautious about?
That's worth naming. Survey articles synthesize existing literature, so the findings are only as good as the research base. And in this case, a lot of the underlying studies are proof of concept or simulation-based, not field-deployed systems. So, the survey maps a promising architecture, but the real-world performance in, say, a remote community with difficult topography remains genuinely unknown.
So the honest take for a rural broadband planner reading this is, here's where things are going, and here's why the engineering is hard. But don't build your 10-year infrastructure strategy around 6G being delivered from the sky by 2028.
That's exactly right. It's a horizon paper, important for strategy, not for procurement.
Fair enough. Let's move to the second piece, which is a bit older but sits in the library for good reason. The open source software paper.
This one is from Eric von Hippel and Georg von Krogh, published in Organization Science in 2003. And it's about what they call the private collective innovation model. The question they're asking is, why would rational, self-interested individuals invest their own time and resources to develop software and then give it away for free?
Which is not how economics textbooks say things work.
Right. The standard models say either you have private investment, where the investor captures a return, patents, licensing, competitive advantage, or you have collective investment, like government funding of public goods, where no individual bears the full cost. Open source doesn't fit either model neatly. You have private investment, developers spending their own time, producing a public good, software anyone can use, with no mechanism for the investor to recapture private returns.
And yet it clearly works. Linux, Apache, half the internet runs on it.
So von Hippel and von Krog's contribution is to show that both conditions can be satisfied simultaneously. The private benefit isn't recaptured through the innovation itself. It comes from other sources. Learning, reputation, the direct use value of solving your own problem. And the collective benefit is the shared code base that everyone builds on.
Now, I want to push on the rural relevance here, because this is a paper about software developers. What does it say to a rural community that isn't a tech hub?
I think the model generalizes more than it might seem. When farmers share crop variety trials informally, when community organizations share programming templates, when rural municipalities pool policy documents, those are all private collective dynamics. Private investment of time and local knowledge, freely shared, producing a public good for the community.
That's an interesting framing. Although I'd push back slightly. The difference is that software is non-rival. If I share my code with you, I still have the code. If I share a piece of equipment or a scarce resource, that's different.
That's a fair distinction. And von Hippel and von Krog do anchor their model in the characteristics of software specifically. Non-rival, easy to replicate, low marginal cost of sharing. So the model doesn't translate automatically to all kinds of rural knowledge sharing. But the underlying logic, that private effort can produce public goods when the incentive structure is right, that does translate.
What are the implications they draw for organizational theory? Because this is published in organization science, so they're speaking to a specific audience.
They're arguing that organizational theory needs a new category. The firm versus market binary doesn't capture hybrid models like this. And for rural innovation, that actually matters. Because a lot of what we see in rural communities doesn't fit the firm model or the market model. It's community organizations, informal networks, shared infrastructure. The private collective framework gives us language for that.
All right. And the third research piece, Open Innovation Beyond High Tech.
This one is from Henry Chesbrough and Adrian Crowther, published in 2006 in R&D Management. And it's doing something quite specific. Chesbrough had introduced the concept of open innovation a few years earlier, the idea that firms should source ideas from outside and commercialize internal ideas externally rather than keeping everything in-house. But the critique was, that only works in industries with rich knowledge ecosystems, pharma, semiconductors, software.
Which leaves out almost everything in a rural economy. Agriculture, processing, trades, forestry.
Exactly the critique. So Chesbrough and Crowther go looking for early adopters of open innovation in non-tech sectors. And what they find is that the model does show up in industries like contract research, biotech spin-offs, and natural resource companies. But the mechanisms are different.
Different how?
In high-tech, open innovation often happens through formal licensing, spin-outs, and R&D partnerships. In the industries they look at, it's more likely to happen through informal relationships, personnel movement, and the absorption of tacit knowledge from suppliers and customers, which is actually a more familiar pattern if you've spent time in rural industry clusters.
The equipment dealer who knows more about on-farm agronomy than anyone at the University Extension Office.
Right. That's open innovation working through a supply chain relationship. Not a formal partnership, not a licensing agreement, but genuine knowledge flow across organizational boundaries.
What do they identify as the conditions that enable this? Because not every industry seems to develop these patterns.
A few things. The degree to which knowledge in the industry is codifiable, whether it can be written down and transferred, matters. So does the presence of intermediaries who can broker knowledge across boundaries, and the competitive dynamics. Industries with moderate competition seem to share more freely than either monopolies or hyper-competitive markets.
That last one is interesting in a rural context, because rural industries often have a small number of players who all know each other, which could cut either way. Maybe you share more because you trust each other, or maybe you're more protective because the market is small.
I think that's genuinely unresolved in the literature. Chesbrough and Crowther don't address rural specifically. They're looking at non-tech industries broadly, and the sample is small enough that they're explicit about not overgeneralizing. But the pattern they identify, open innovation working through relationships rather than formal IP mechanisms, feels like the most plausible model for rural industry clusters.
So if you had to pull a through line across all three of these research pieces, the 6G survey, the open source model, and the open innovation in non-tech industries, what is it?
I'd say it's about the conditions under which knowledge moves, across network layers, across organizational boundaries, across sectors that weren't supposed to be doing this. All three papers are fundamentally asking, How does something that was designed for one context get adapted and used somewhere else? And that's the rural innovation question at its core.
I'd add one more thread, the underestimation problem. All three papers are correcting an assumption that something doesn't apply somewhere it actually does. 6G can reach rural areas. Open source principles generalize beyond software. Open innovation works outside high tech. There's a pattern of the field catching up to what's already happening on the ground.
That's a fair read. All right, let's move to the news segment.
We've got a few strong items this week. Let's start with Vietnam, because I think it's the most instructive for the kind of systemic approach to rural digital transformation.
So the coverage from OpenGov Asia is about Vietnam's national effort to transform rural communes into what they're calling smart, livable areas. And the pilot that gets the most attention is Giao Nhân, a commune that has stood up digital government services, smart classrooms, intelligent camera networks, and remote healthcare platforms.
That's a significant bundle of infrastructure to deploy simultaneously in a rural commune.
It is. And the government's stated ambition is that 80% of Vietnam's communes meet the criteria for smart rural status, which involves meeting thresholds on digital services, connectivity, and participation by a target date.
What strikes me about the Vietnam model is that it's coordinated top-down in a way that's quite different from how most rural digital development happens in Canada or the United States. There, it tends to be community-driven, often underfunded patchwork.
Right, and there's a real tension there. The Vietnamese model can deploy at scale and create consistent standards. But there's a question about whether centrally designed digital infrastructure actually fits the specific needs of each community, or whether it creates a kind of digital homogenization where every commune gets the same system regardless of local context.
The smart classroom in Giao Nhân might be exactly what that community needs. Or it might be a system designed for urban schools that doesn't work for the local curriculum or the teacher capacity available.
And we don't know from this coverage, honestly. It's descriptive journalism, not an evaluation. So the honest answer is promising model, genuine questions about fit and sustainability. The thing to watch is whether these deployments are still being used actively in 3 to 5 years.
Which is the graveyard of so many rural tech pilots. The installation happens, there's a ribbon cutting, and then the bandwidth goes unused because the maintenance capacity isn't there.
Exactly. Let's go to Kenya, because the Kenyan story is structurally different, and I think usefully so.
The Agricultural Data and Digital Policy Draft. Walk me through it.
So Kenya has released a draft policy framework, not deployed infrastructure, but a governance framework, for transforming the agricultural sector through digital systems and data governance. The centerpiece is a new institution called the Kenya Agricultural Digital Information Center, which is designed to coordinate digital programs across the sector and manage sector-wide data.
That's interesting because it's leading with governance before technology, which is unusual.
It is. And I think that's actually the more sophisticated approach. The policy covers AI, Internet of Things applications in agriculture, and data interoperability. But the frame is, who owns the data, who can access it, who governs it, before we deploy the sensors.
Why does that matter for smallholder farmers specifically? Because that's who the majority of Kenyan agricultural land involves.
Because smallholder farmer data is enormously valuable to input companies, to commodity traders, to insurers, and without a governance framework, the default outcome is that that value gets extracted by whoever has the technical capacity to collect and analyze it, which is rarely the farmer.
So the policy is essentially trying to create a framework for data sovereignty in the agricultural sector before the extractive systems get fully established.
That's how I'd read it. Whether it succeeds is an open question. Draft policies have a long road to implementation. But the ambition is notable, and I'd say it's directly relevant to conversations happening in Canadian agriculture right now about farm data ownership.
100%. The parallels to what's being debated around precision agriculture data in Saskatchewan and Alberta, are very direct.
Now, the two stories about rural women entrepreneurs in India. I want to spend some real time on these because they're doing something the academic literature often struggles to capture.
Right. And we have two pieces, one from the Better India and one from Krish A. Jagran. They're covering overlapping territory, but with different case studies. What's the pattern you're seeing?
So across both pieces, you've got women in states like Assam, Rajasthan, Kerala, and central India building agricultural enterprises without venture capital, without formal business training in most cases, and doing it by solving very specific local problems.
Give me a specific example.
The Better India piece describes an entrepreneur who's turning agricultural waste into fertilizer. That's a local resource, what would otherwise be a disposal problem, converted into a product that other farmers need. It's circular and hyper-local.
And the Krishi Jagran piece. The case studies there include Anita Moody, Kanti Oraon, Kante oraon, siya maravi, siya mahrahve. What are they doing?
Climate-smart agriculture, organic inputs, and collective market access. Shamaravi's story in particular is about transforming her village through community-based food systems, not just building her own business, but changing the economic structure of the community around her.
That's the part that gets underreported in the standard entrepreneurship narrative. We talk about the individual innovator, the founder. But in rural contexts, successful ventures often have this community multiplier effect that doesn't show up in the revenue numbers.
And I think that's worth sitting with, because the metrics we use to evaluate rural entrepreneurship, employment created, revenue generated, investment attracted, may be systematically undercounting the value being created when one person's venture changes the market access, or the input costs, or the social infrastructure for an entire village.
One thing that strikes me about both pieces, none of these businesses are technology startups in any conventional sense. They're rooted in agriculture, food processing, livestock, which connects back to the Chesbrough paper, open innovation working outside the tech sector through relationships and local knowledge.
And the one about connecting pastoralists to national markets, that's explicitly a market access problem solved through relationship building and logistics knowledge, not through a platform or an app.
That said, I want to gently push back on one framing in both pieces. They're quite celebratory, success stories format, and there's not much about the failures, or about the structural barriers these women face that other entrepreneurs in urban or more connected settings don't face.
That's a fair critique. Solutions journalism has that limitation. You see the 5 who made it. You don't see the 50 who had comparable ideas and comparable effort and didn't, because the credit wasn't there, or the infrastructure wasn't there, or the household constraints were too heavy.
Which doesn't diminish the stories at all. It just means they're examples, not a representative sample. And the policy question is, what systemic changes would have made more of those 50 succeed?
Agreed. Let's go to the last news item before the organization segment, the Estevan to Drayton Valley story.
This one is close to home for this show. Estevan's Southeast Tech Hub, which is actually the organization founded by our producer, Gordon Moore, is expanding its model to other rural communities, including Drayton Valley in Alberta.
And the core problem it's addressing is one that comes up constantly in the rural innovation literature: digital skills gaps and youth out-migration. Young people leave rural communities not only because there are no jobs, but because the jobs that exist don't match the skills they want to develop. Or the skills that exist locally don't match the jobs that are emerging.
The computer science training through Southeast College is the anchor here. It's connecting young people with local industry partners, which means the training isn't abstract, it's pointed at real employment in the community.
And what's interesting about the replication model is that it's not a franchise. It's not Southeast Tech Hub opening a branch office in Drayton Valley. It's sharing the model, the curriculum design, the partnership structure, the community engagement approach, so that Drayton Valley can build its own version.
Which is actually the private collective innovation model we discussed earlier. They've invested in building something, and now they're sharing it freely so other communities can adapt it.
That connection hadn't occurred to me, but it's a good one. The private investment is the years of work building the Estevan model. The collective benefit is every rural community that can now adapt it without starting from scratch.
And the question for Drayton Valley, and for any other community that tries to replicate this, is what's context-specific versus what's transferable. Because Alberta's energy economy, the specific industry partners available, the demographics, those are different from Southeast Saskatchewan.
Which is probably why the model being shared is a model and not a kit. The principles transfer. The local implementation has to be built locally.
All right, let's get to the organization segment, and then we'll bring it all together.
This week, we've got a few organizations and one event thread worth flagging for people who work in this space.
Let's start with Southeast Tech Hub itself, since it came up in the news segment. For listeners who aren't familiar, what is it and who's it for?
Southeast Tech Hub is based in Estevan, Saskatchewan, and it's focused on building digital skills and technology capacity in rural communities. It runs training programs, industry partnerships, and community engagement initiatives, with a particular focus on keeping young people engaged in rural economies rather than following the standard path of moving to larger urban centers.
And it's worth saying, this is a real organization doing real work in a real small city in Canada's prairies. Not a policy paper about what should be done, an operational model that can be looked at and learned from.
The website and the full profile are in the Rural Innovations directory at ruralinnovations.org if you want to go deeper on what they're doing.
The Vietnam and Kenya stories we covered in the news segment also point toward organizations worth watching. On the Vietnam side, the Digital Commune Initiative represents a government-coordinated model of rural transformation that other countries are paying attention to.
And on the Kenya side, the Kenya Agricultural Digital Information Center, once it's established, will be a significant institution to track. It's designed to be the coordinating body for all agricultural digital programs in the country. If it gets built and resourced, it's the kind of institution that doesn't really exist in most of the global south.
And even if the draft policy takes years to implement, which is likely, the institution building question is interesting. Who gets to sit at that table? What data does it actually govern? How does it relate to the private sector players who are already collecting agricultural data?
Those are the implementation questions that will determine whether the policy framework actually protects smallholders or just provides cover for the same extractive dynamics with a government logo on top.
Harsh, but not unfair. On the events side, I'd flag that if you're working in rural digital skills development, the Estevan model being shared with Drayton Valley is worth following closely, not as a news story, but as a replication case study. If someone is building a similar initiative in a resource economy rural community, this is a living experiment to learn from.
And the Rural Innovations Library is continuing to build out the organization's directory. So if you know of an organization doing meaningful rural innovation work that isn't in there, ruralinnovations.org has a submission mechanism.
All right, let's slow down for the closing segment, because I think there's a bigger pattern across this week's items that's worth naming.
I've been thinking about this since the research segment. What's the thread?
The question of what actually travels. What knowledge, what model, what infrastructure can be picked up from one context and put down in another, and what can't?
That's the replication question, and it's live in every single item this week.
Right. The 6G Aerospace network architecture. It's a system designed largely by researchers and engineers in well-resourced institutions, imagining deployment in a wide range of contexts. But the survey is honest that the performance in difficult terrain with limited maintenance capacity is unknown. The architecture might travel, the reliability might not.
The open source model travels, but only under specific conditions. The private collective dynamic von Hippel and von Krogh described depends on the non-rival nature of the resource being shared. When you try to apply that logic to physical infrastructure or scarce local knowledge, the model strains.
The open innovation model travels beyond high tech, but through different mechanisms, relationships instead of licensing, tacit knowledge instead of codified IP. So the model travels, but in a form that's harder to measure and harder to intentionally design.
And then you have Vietnam's smart commune model, which is quite explicitly designed to travel at scale within a single national context. 80% of communes getting the same digital infrastructure package.
Which raises a question I keep coming back to. Is uniformity at scale actually what rural communities need? Or does it produce a situation where every community has the same dashboard, but none of them have the local capacity to actually use it in a locally meaningful way?
I think there's a legitimate tension there, and I don't want to be too quick to dismiss the Vietnamese model. There's a real cost to local customization. If every community builds its own version of everything, you lose the efficiency gains from shared infrastructure, shared standards, shared training. The question is where the customization has to happen to make the generic infrastructure actually work.
And I think the India entrepreneurship stories point to an answer. Those women didn't need a customized government program. They needed access to markets, to credit, and, in some cases, to logistics knowledge that would let them connect to demand that already existed. The innovation was local. The infrastructure that needed to travel was relatively generic.
So maybe the frame is, generic infrastructure can travel, but the innovating has to happen locally. You can't ship in the innovation.
Which sounds obvious when you say it that way, but a lot of rural development policy does try to ship in the innovation. The smart classroom system, the pre-built app for market access, the standardized curriculum for digital skills training.
And to be fair to those programs, sometimes the local innovation capacity doesn't exist yet. You might need to ship in a working example before the local capacity to iterate on it develops. There's a sequencing question here.
That's where the Estevan to Drayton Valley story is genuinely instructive. What Southeast Tech Hub is sharing isn't a piece of software or a piece of infrastructure. It's a way of working. A methodology for connecting local youth to local industry through skills development. That's something that requires local adaptation to work, and the act of adapting it probably builds some of the capacity that's needed.
The replication is itself a form of capacity building.
Exactly, and I think that's a different model than most of what we see in the Vietnam and Kenya stories, where the deployment is happening from above. Not wrong necessarily, but different in terms of what it builds locally.
I want to add one more dimension here, which is the data question. Kenya's draft policy is fundamentally about governance of what travels once rural communities are connected. The data that gets generated by sensors, by digital health platforms, by smart infrastructure, that data travels very efficiently to wherever the technical capacity to use it lives, and that's usually not the rural community.
So the asymmetry is, the infrastructure travels in, and then the value travels out. And unless there's a governance framework, like what Kenya is trying to build, that asymmetry is just the default outcome of digital development in rural areas.
Which is maybe the most important sentence from this week's entire briefing. The infrastructure travels in, and the value travels out. That's not inevitable, but it requires deliberate policy to prevent.
And that's true whether we're talking about 6G satellites delivering connectivity to remote communities, or AI-enabled precision agriculture generating farm data, or digital skills training that equips young people to work remotely. And then they do work remotely from somewhere else.
The rural brain drain problem isn't solved by digital skills training if the skills are fully portable and the economic geography still favors urban centers. You need the local economic opportunity to also be there.
Which is the Southeast Tech Hub bet. Build the skills and the local industry partnerships simultaneously, so the skills have somewhere to land locally.
It's a reasonable bet. Whether it holds at scale, in communities that don't have an active industry hub already, is the open question. And that's where the research base is still pretty thin.
Something for next week's library editions to help answer, hopefully.
That's the week. The full library, every article we discussed, and the newsletter that started this whole conversation are at ruralinnovations.org.
See you next Friday.